Welcome to the Trad Line.
You always do something new at the end.
I know, because I just have to. Gotta keep it fresh. Today we're talking about how we became more traditional in our living and like kind of how we started going to why it's so important, why you should do it too.
Yeah.
You can start with your journey to living the more traditional faith.
So,
Kyle, my husband.
For me, it started 2013. I was living in Pittsburgh, and there's obviously a lot of beautiful churches in Pittsburgh. And, I would go to different ones to check them out and to just see what it was like. And something happened in Pittsburgh that I was not used to or I'd never really experienced or seen before, whether in New Jersey or in college in Ohio. And that is that they wore, a lot of people actually wore Steelers shirts and uniforms to Mass, right? Because obviously in the United States, football is played on Sundays. And it was a real sort of expedition of what the real religion is. But anybody who's been or in and around Pittsburgh knows how important the Steelers are to the people there. But anyway, so that was very off-putting to me. I just kind of looked around more, whatever. And about 10 minutes from where I lived, there was this Newman Center. That was the Newman Center for, I was not in school, but it was the Newman Center for UPitt and Carnegie Mellon. It was done by I never know what it is, the orations or the oratorians, whatever it is, of Philip Neri. And good, solid priests, Orthodox, etc. But still, Novus Ordo, but it was a Latinized Novus Ordo. Very intense sermons, really intense and good confession. They had 24-hour adoration, so that's just where I really went mostly. And then from that, I became curious, so I tried the Latin Mass at a place called St. Boniface, which was the Latin Mass parish at the time in Pittsburgh. I did not continuously go there, interestingly. So the Latinized Mass at the oratory, had a scola. It was a high Mass. It was really beautiful. I didn't understand the theological differences, so I much more preferred that to the low Mass. So that's why I primarily was going there.
The reverent Novus Ordo to the Latin Mass.
Yeah, because it was and I didn't understand it yet, etc. And it was far, and when you're in your early mid-20s on a Sunday morning, it's like the last thing you want to do is drive 30 minutes commuting. When you could drive 10. So that is what I did. Then I went to Franciscan. So before I'd gone to Franciscan, I went to a summer conference, a few actually, with my grandfather. And
summer conference at Franciscan.
Sorry, at Franciscan. And that was my first real forte, whatever you want to call it, into charismatic Catholicism. I had never seen that before. I had never seen like the hands with the praying or like the, whatever. And I did not like it. It made me uncomfortable. I wasn't against it at the time, at least, whereas I am now.
Yeah.
And that's later.
So your like initial pull to the more traditional was actually getting away from something.
Yeah.
You saw things you didn't like in the churches you were going to, and you were like, that seems weird. And so you were seeking out, you were kind of running away. Not running away, but
yeah, no, that's a fair way to put it. When I got to Franciscan, I went to St. Peter's, which is where we got married. Of course, it's where we started going to the Latin Mass. But at the time, I went to the Novus Ordo Mass, and their Novus Ordo is a unicorn, of course, right? So like their high Mass is essentially as good as you can get, right? So it's ad orientem, beautiful music, Latin.
Altar rail, receiving on the tongue, no lay ministers,
right?
Communion, no altar girls.
Right. But again, at that point, didn't know the theology. We would still go to daily Mass sometimes at the school. But where we really started going more to the Latin Mass was actually daily Mass, low Mass at St. Peter's. So that's how it started. And then, of course, we started going there primarily. So it wasn't just the move to the the Latin Mass at that point. We were starting to go to St. Peter's for daily Mass, period, because it had the Ad Orientem, the sort of more reverent thing, versus the charismatic aspects of
the chapel
at Franciscan.
Yeah, you mentioned that you didn't grow up with anything charismatic at all, really.
Mm-hmm.
But the parishes in my hometown that we went to always had a sprinkle of that, because most of our priests were Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were very much into like the theatrics kind of. One of them was actually a former soap opera star in the Philippines. And so and he was the same one who rode on Palm Sunday. He rode a donkey down the aisle, a real life donkey down the aisle. And then he also did this thing where at the end of every Mass, he would, for like the recessional, I don't know if it was the recessional or maybe before they walked out. That's what it was. It started and then he would walk out. So he would start the song up on the altar, clap, and he would be clapping and stepping side to side, and he would, be going like this. Everyone stand up and clap and dance. It was just so cringy, and I never liked that kind of vibe or style at all, ever. Any retreat I would ever go on during like the young, by the way, like 10, 11, 12, if there was like the praise and worship, and everyone around me, by the way, was up with their arms out, the clapping, the crying. I remember just being like, this is not like...
Yeah, but it wasn't really a theological thing. It was more...
No, I had no idea.
It was more like, you're like, this is weird.
I don't know. Just felt, off. And it just always made me cringe. So, but I would say my journey was basically it was with you, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I always preferred, when it came to that, more...
Mm-hmm.
Like, I never liked that. But I didn't really know anything about... Like, I didn't know... anything really. And so then when we met and started dating and then started going to St. Peter's, and then basically everything for me was just kind of following you.
What happened was the summer of 2018 happened, which was the McCarrick scandal. So basically we discovered that not only had McCarrick been this huge abuser, but Pope Francis, let him back into ministry and all these sorts of things. This is one of those inconvenient facts that I find so many younger Catholics, especially like these younger like pundits and things, they always like to forget, because they weren't around back then. They became Catholic 2 or 3 years ago, or started becoming serious 3, 4, 5 years ago. And there's like this blindness to what happened before. But so that kind of opened things up in understanding this idea of this lavender mafia, as it's called, the St. Gallen mafia, which, helped elect Pope Francis.
I think a lot of people don't know what those things are.
Okay, fair. So the St. Gallen mafia and the lavender mafia. Okay, so the St. Gallen mafia, if a lot of people don't know, so Austin Ivory is the official biographer of Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. He said in his book, and especially in the first edition, that this St. Gallen mafia, meaning they met in St. Gallen, Switzerland, was instrumental in getting Pope Francis elected. They have that because Godfrey de Niels was the one who said that they did that. Godfrey de Niels, I can't remember if he was a Dutch, but he was a European cardinal who was one of the St. Gallen mafia, who said, yes, this is what we did. And that included a lot of the heterodox guys like Marx, Walter Casper. They are a leftist group, and they worked to get Pope Francis elected. The Lavender Mafia is the name for the sort of underground, heavy fingertips club. So I started learning about all these things. I started reading about what's happened in the church. Some of the hijacking of the council around Vatican II.
Was this kind of when you learned, or did you know about this too? It's like though I guess that is kind of the infiltration, right?
Yeah.
When you say infiltration of the church,
yeah, this is before. So if you're talking about like Taylor Marshall's book,
well,
this is before he ever wrote that.
I'm just
for
using
sure.
his word, kind of.
Yeah. No, I mean, so there are some other books though that showed the Anti-Apostle, I think it's called 1025, had it. There were some good books, I think, by Roberto de Mattei.
Instrumental in getting... Belladad.
Yeah, so there's all those stories.
Who did she help infiltrate into the church? She got all of the
so
communists?
A bunch of communists.
Oh,
She
became
Catholic from Fulton Sheen.
Fulton Sheen, yeah.
And she told Fulton Sheen that her job was to infiltrate the Catholic Church, that she placed as many as like 1,100 priests into the Catholic Church, and specifically that there
Communist.
Yes, exactly. Infiltrated, meaning like they are there to be destroyers.
Yeah.
And she also told him that she had 4 high-ranking cardinals. For whatever reason, Fulton Sheen said to her to not reveal the names, so we don't know who it is. But so that's what she said. There's other things along those same lines, like when Pope Paul VI had Gagnon, I think his name, like Archbishop Gagnon. He's a Canadian. He did a research project in the 80s. Was it in the 80s? No, I'm sorry. It would have been. He would have started it in the 60s, and then he did it all the way through the 80s when JP2 pulled him back. If you ever want to hear more about him, look up a priest called Father Charles Murr. We can maybe put it in show notes. Murr. But he was his roommate at the time. But basically, he came to Pope Paul VI and said, "Here are all the Masons within the church." That stuff I wasn't necessarily reading about, but what I did read about is the changes in the Mass. And so specifically, how it started for me at least, is I researched this guy named Annibale Bugnini, who was essentially the writer or the creator of the new Mass. He's also the creator under Pius XII of the 1955 Holy Week changes, where there's just a bunch of changes there. And then afterwards, he famously wrote the new Mass, and sort of a famous aspect of that is he ended up, long story short, being essentially exiled by Pope Paul VI to being the nuncio in Iran or Iraq, one of those two, because what happened was he played Pope Paul VI and the writers of the new Mass against each other. He would say to him, "This is what everybody's saying," and then he would go back to the writers and say, "This is what the Pope is saying," and he came by essentially his own designs, and there was quite a bit of evidence that he was in fact a Mason. As I learned the theological differences, etc., I came to a few conclusions. One is that we've been scammed. Okay, so that however you want to look at Vatican II, whether it's the people who say, well, there's errors, or there's people who say, no, it was the Vatican, everything's perfect, or no, there's some, like for instance, Bishop Snyder says there's some line items, we could do some line item editing, or no, it's just the spirit, right? Whatever. Is no matter what actually the answer to that is, the fact is that in practice, in effect, things have changed from a focused perspective, right? So we know that the church can't change its doctrine. I think, in fact, the CDF just recently came out and said, if you say that that Vatican II changed doctrine, you're a heretic or something like that. But so we know that it nothing can change doctrine. Of course, Pope Paul VI even specifically said it was a pastoral council. There's no dogmatic definitions. But regardless of however that all worked, because that's not really my concern at the moment, the big thing was, as I said, the Catholic Church emphasized, taught, focused on a pretty consistent thing for this long, right? And then Vatican II, and the spirit of Vatican II, however you want to phrase it, doesn't matter. After that, there is a new focus, a new practice, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so as I discovered that, and specifically around the new Mass, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, feelings like anger, hurt, felt like you feel robbed, Because I think, again, that depth is so... The depth is so deep. Yeah, it's so pervasive in the faith, and realizing that I was kind of being fed this like kiddie meal version.
It's so funny you say kiddie meal because I was thinking of an analogy and I was like, yeah, it's like having, a certain type of food here and then you have the real, how it's supposed to be cooked and it's 1,000 times better and you're mad that you're eating the crap the whole time.
That was like when we went to that steakhouse that one time.
Oh yeah. I was like, this is steak.
Yeah. So then at that point we became where we started going to, at St. Peter's, by the way, Latin Mass on Sundays only. Of course. What?
It's just funny because when I think back, the way you function, you've always been this way too, is you learn all of this, of what you just said. You do all of this reading and learning and researching. And then you come to this conclusion, okay, we're going to start going to Latin Mass. Then you came to me and you didn't say, Olivia, listen to this. Listen to everything I like. Did you know, blah, blah, blah. You just say, we're going to Latin Mass now. Which is fun. And I was kind of like, what? Huh? Yeah. But it's so funny because you've always been that way where like and you don't do it on purpose. You don't say like, I don't owe her an explanation. We're going. That's not what you're doing. You just are like, you're thinking about all of these things in your head. And then you're just telling me like, we're going to Latin Mass. And then of course, when I asked like, and I was like, okay, well,
I feel like I had to be mentioning it sometimes because I was reading like 3-4 hours a day.
Yeah, but you call people. I don't know, but I did not know all of this stuff. When you said we're going to start going to Latin Mass, I didn't know all of this. I think you kind of said like it's because I just remember saying like, okay.
Maybe I was calling Papa a lot.
Yeah,
like when I was discovering it. Yeah,
something. But it's just funny. It's the same thing with Cashin's baptism. When I was pregnant with Cashin, you said we're doing an old rite baptism, and I'm thinking like, okay, that's. Can you tell me what the difference is? I don't even know what the difference is. And then you'd be like, yeah, like these, and then we would have the conversation about it. But it's always so funny because you always lead with your conclusion of what we're going to be doing instead of being like.
Well, no, it's funny because I was thinking like, for instance, if we were to move or something, where would we go? I feel like I'm always mentioning different places. But I could also see where I would come and be like, all right, this is where we're moving.
Totally. And then it's always like, I usually always say like, okay. And then I'll be like, why?
Yeah.
It's kind of like we say to the kids, like say, okay. And then ask why.
Well, it is funny because, so we live in a town called Lakewood Ranch now. And what did it take? It took like 3 or 4 times coming. Yeah. For you to be like,
persuade me. So Kyle was learning all this insane stuff about the church and about the differences in the Mass, and most of it you were doing through reading.
Yeah, mostly reading. At the time, there was some YouTube. So I think that was about when Taylor, Marshall, and Tim Gordon had their like TNT stuff. So I watched some of that.
What about Mass of the Ages?
No, that was after.
That was a while after.
Time. Yeah, no, the big things that I read was that the biography, because again, what started me down the path was reading about this guy. I'd say 1 Peter 5, they had a lot of really good articles that were very, very helpful. Like that's what took me down. Like, so I found, Professor Peter Kwasniewski. He's a really good writer on this topic. And so is those sorts of things.
I needed a snack break because I'm pregnant. Just kidding. Clickbait.
So yeah, basically that's where I was learning all of it. Unfortunately, we got married.
Better finish that sentence.
We had the note sort of because we were like, oh, people won't get it and whatever. So that was a big mistake. But
yeah, we said that in our last episode. I think.
We did.
That would have been one of the things that we changed was having a Latin Mass wedding. Mass of the Ages is now such an awesome resource.
Yeah, that's especially the best resource, I think. At least
the first 2 episodes. Right? I don't know if I've seen the
third. So so their 3 episodes they have 3 episodes are good. They start out with like the beauty of the Latin Mass and the beauty of tradition, which is wonderful. I think the real kind of home run episode is number 2.
Yeah, number 2 is so good.
And the reason for that is I think that there are a lot of people who will say, oh, I love the Latin Mass. I just prefer this. Or, yeah, the Latin Mass is fine, but I just prefer that. Which, like, number 1, that's what they kind of go along with, right? Like, they're saying, look how awesome, like, beautiful and the tradition, etc. But I think the number 2 is important, and in a certain sense even more important, because it sets up the contrast.
Yeah.
Of course they talk about Bugnini, which I think is important to everyone to know. And why don't we link that, by the way? They also talk about the theological changes in the offertory and what the priest says, the freedom of the priest, the reduction of the number of signs of the crosses, the changes of, like I said, the offertory prayer. Like offertory prayer 1 in the Novus Ordo is like the traditional Roman offertory. Number 2, famously, was written in a diner in Rome on a napkin. And it's such now that because the priest has freedom to choose certain things, that because even my grandmother, this is interesting. So Nana, she's 85, Italian from New Jersey. So she lived 37 years of her life going to Latin Mass only. That's what she grew up in. Until like a year ago when I was talking to her about it, she thought that the Novus Ordo was the Latin Mass in English. So that's a perfect example. This is somebody who grew up in the church, has been going her whole life, etc.
When you said to me that we're doing the old rite baptism for cash-in,
Yeah.
and I said, I have no idea, like, what's the difference? I don't know. And I pulled it up to read through it. And I was stunned.
Yeah.
Because I was like, this is, first of all, drop dead beautiful, the old rite baptism. And I was like, why aren't they doing this stuff anymore?
Yeah.
Like, why aren't they doing the exorcism parts? And why aren't they doing the blessed salt? And why aren't they doing all of these, like...
Yeah.
They're so... I mean, at the time, before I got everything more, I was like, this is so beautiful. And I was so excited to do it.
Yeah.
And so that's just a good... It's the same for the Mass.
Yeah.
You read through all these things they do in the Mass, and you're like, why don't they do this anymore?
Right. Yeah. So going back to like some of those differences in episode 2, it's such that basically I think it's 11% of overlap. So when you talk about, it's possible that for like the same Mass as 11% could be retained. Again, then you have to ask or question and ask the question of, okay, then what happened, right? Why did this happen? And not only why did it happen, but why am I being told that it didn't happen?
Yeah.
Because that was kind of, again, one of the biggest things for me, which is, it's like the don't believing the lying eyes, or your lying eyes, or the kind of in vogue word gaslighting, right? Like that's what I really felt like. It's like I have eyes, I can read, kind of similar to COVID. It's like I can see, I can see this, and I can see this, and I can see that they're different.
Yeah.
And that this clearly is not a continuation of this. And you're telling me it is.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, and the squaring of the circle's never been done. It's been attempted. And of course, and I think another thing that it kind of highlights that it's never been done is just the epithets that are thrown at people like us or others who are kind of like, hey, I don't just prefer the Latin Mass. I think everybody should go to the Latin Mass. And by the way, like it's not a commentary on the validity or the fact that the Eucharist is valid, or that it gives grace, or that somebody can't receive more grace going there than I can receive at the Latin Mass if they're better disposed, etc. It's not commenting on all that. Talking about the human element, which is the liturgical form of the Mass, the actual Mass. So, and all of those sorts of things. And then obviously the things that we've talked about, receiving on the hand versus the tongue, that orientum, these postures that clearly lend themselves to Eucharistic adoration, not just the practice of, but I'm saying like actually adoring the Eucharist, reverence for it, those sorts of things. So it was that change. And I'd say when we started going exclusively, really, and by the way, we still go on occasion to Novus Ordo. It's like for us, Sunday obligation, or like daily Mass on occasion if we can't make it to the other joint. The thing that I realized about the Latin Mass on its own is how naturally catechetical it was or is, again, just like in and of itself. So the biggest thing that I learned, and I didn't learn this by reading it, even though maybe I knew it intellectually speaking, is that what I remembered, or what I learned, however you want to say, is that salvation is primarily God's work. And I am an assister, or, you know, a cooperator in that, right? Because in the Novus Ordo, when you have it versus populum, or, you know, facing the people, and you have all of these human elements. I mean, even, you know, Pope Benedict talked about like clapping or cheering for the singing in Mass. And I think he said, you know, it's like you're bringing a human element into it. Is all these human elements, it tends to lift the pride of the people, because you are lifting yourself to be more important. And in a certain sense, it brings God down. So a lot of people like to say the Novus Ordo Mass is horizontal, whereas the traditional Mass is vertical. Mm-hmm. So what I realized when I did that is what Jesus had done and what he essentially is doing is so much more primarily responsible for my salvation. Now, that's something that we can kind of just say, oh, yeah, obviously, right? Like from an intellectual perspective. But it was the biggest sort of aha moment for me that the Latin Mass essentially gave me just on my own, or I'm sorry, on its own, right? It was not me reading or studying or kind of getting that. It was just purely this understanding that, oh my gosh, like, because you're watching the Mass and you're watching the representation of the sacrifice of Calvary, and the priest is up there doing it, and he's doing it silently, and he's doing it on your behalf. And it's like, this is what saves me. Mm-hmm. Everything is like in relation. Everything I do is so little. And so that, like, you know, carries over into spirituality as well. So, you know, because again, so much of modern spirituality is sort of based in sentimentality, and it's self-centered, and it's, you know, how close am I to God based on what I feel or how I am, or how holy am I being, etc. It's just these sorts of things fall away, and there's like a certain purification of the motives, I think, that happens. So anyway, so that was something, just as an example from the Latin Mass, that just on its own,
I think
it did for me, like, in specifically, I guess, like the humility, just kind of where you're just like, oh my gosh, this is what's been done for me, that sort of thing.
Who said when you're in Mass, you're supposed to be meditating on the sacrifice through the whole Mass?
I think I know what you're talking about. So Padre Pio said during the offertory and consecration,
you're at Calvary.
Yeah. In your mind's eye, go to the foot of the cross at Calvary.
Yes.
So this is something I had known for a long time. And legitimately, I would be at a Novus Ordo Mass, and I'd be like, how am I supposed to do this? Because everybody's talking.
So distracting.
Not only the priest, but it's like, but then people are, And then we went to the Latin Mass, and I think it was like very early on.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
this is how you do it.
This is why.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what you were talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I remember you said that to me early, that exact thing. You were like, oh, there's this, you know, put yourself in your mind's eye at the foot of the cross. And when you're in the Novus Ordo, you're having to do the responses, the random songs throughout that you're singing, and you just can't get to that place. And not only that, but like all of the bells and the smells, as you like to say, where it's like you have the incense and the chant, and it's so much, especially as a mom with young kids. Yeah. I'm not holding a missal reading the readings. But I don't need to be. It's so much more conducive to meditating on, you know, what you're supposed to be, even when I'm wrestling the toddler, because I'm smelling the smells, and I'm hearing, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So, and
of course, a Novus Ordo can have the proper smells and bells. The theological aspect, I think, is what's important, because it properly conveys the faith. Yeah. But the smells and bells are so important because we are corporal beings. You know, we have bodies, you know, and we're composite, right? So it's like they inform each other. So a perfect example is like in psychology, you talk about, okay, when you're happy, your chest is out, your shoulders are back, you're laughing, you're smiling, you know, yeah, right. But what they've also found is the reverse is true, right? So like if you start by smiling, laugh, you know, you actually start, like your brain shoots like happiness, right?
Force yourself into being
happy. And it's the same thing, right? So if you breathe slow and low, and go like this and, hunch and whatever.
That's like
it's
Kyle,
the same sort of
you
thing.
always tease me when I'm like, if I'm upset, so you're like, you're uncross your arms. He always says, uncross your arms. 'Cause if I get upset about something, I go like this. And he goes, oh, there you are with your arms crossed. Uncross your arms.
Yeah. Well, so, because it does, your physiology informs your psychology. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to do that. So similar things. So a lot of people say like how you pray is how you believe. And of course, what they mean by that is not just what you say, but what you're doing. So like if you're on your knees before a thing, you're more naturally going to reverence that thing because you're on your knees. Mm-hmm. So dress. Of course, there's a certain level of immodesty that can happen so often at a lot of parishes. But, like people will say, oh, you're working from home, still get dressed up, because you take yourself more seriously, you act more seriously, etc. So it's the same thing. When you dress seriously, when you're going to mass, there's just like those things make a difference. And then of course, from a music decoration perspective, the beauty, right? Beauty is a transcendent. What it means is it helps us raise our hearts and minds to God. So that's why objective beauty is so important, right? So it's not just something where it's like, oh, it's preference, right? And that's why it's such an offense when you see some of these churches, especially where we're in Florida. And Florida has some of the worst because we don't have the history of Catholicism down here.
So bad, which is ironic because the first Catholic Mass in the U.S. was celebrated here.
Yes, that's true. And then of course for kids, obviously something with kids we're very adamant about is, of course, taking them to Latin Mass, but only Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. And a big reason for that is, again, before the age of 7, they're such sponges that they soak it all up. So we want them soaking up the reverence, the proper dress, all the smells and bells, etc.
Because it is so true that when you really do become desensitized to all of the things that you witness at Novus Ordo. And I remember once we'd been going to Latin Mass for I want to say about a year or so, the first time going to a Novus Ordo again, I just couldn't believe it. Yeah. I was like, wow, everything, like notice everything. You become so much more sensitive to these things. The kids, it's like you want them, and it's sad, but in a sense you want them to be sensitive.
And it's not only sensitivity. The real thing is that their subconscious mind, which picks all of these things up as they grow older, is that these are the imprints on their subconscious mind, right? Yeah. So that's the most important thing. So that without knowing why, right? And by the way, this is why, you have people who can come back to the church later, or, you'll have people like there's a famous guy, atheist, his name's, I have a stupid face in my head. The really famous one, Hitchens. No, Hitchens is the dead one. Oh, why can't I think of his name? Here we go. Dawkins.
Oh,
Richard Dawkins. That's who I
could have told you that.
He actually said recently, and of course he's in England where it's getting overrun by Muslims and such, but he said recently that he misses, essentially, he's anti-Christian, but he misses Christian culture, right? But my point is that like these pinings that he has and others have for this sort of things, or I have a cousin who I'm still working on to bring back to the faith, but he has like all these moral beliefs. It's like, well, where do these moral beliefs come from? It's like, because they are built in subconscious beliefs that have not been actively changed, right? So like there's certain things that of course he's going to choose and you're going to make choices in your life of things that are conscious, but there's like those subconscious pulls. That's your subconscious mind. So for the children, it's so important that their subconscious sees that, right? So that, and kind of going what you're saying is, so that if they see somebody receiving communion in the hand, that's odd. That's it pricks their conscience. It doesn't seem correct. And what that allows for is it allows for a greater Eucharistic reverence. Now, this is, I'm talking about in general, right? Because there are individuals who are able to overcome this. But in general, when you see something like, so for instance, if I do a consecration, right, and I go like this and bells ring, everyone's silent, it's raised up, it's elevated, etc., everybody's focused on that brings something different than if I do a consecration. And by the way, kneeling before, kneeling after the elevation, versus nonchalant picking up this, whatever. I mean, even if I go around, take this, it's so much like you.
Yeah.
And there's also something odd about that, right? It's like Jesus in my hand before me. And what do I do with Jesus in my hand before me? You.
Yeah.
There's something odd about that. It's those sorts of things that are a sort of like, a natural, again, your subconscious mind sees that, analyzes it, and says that thing is not as important as in the other situation. Same thing, you're seeing everyone go down on their knees, on their tongue. It's clearly a very particular, and I'm really getting out here with this, with my arms. Yeah, I just felt.
That's okay. We like that.
That's how I've always been. So anyway, but you see people kneeling,
in
receiving on the tongue, etc. That gives, again, a different impression than people going up, and of course, some people take it reverently, but so often it's, first of all, it's in the hand, but then some, that, or just all sorts of things. Yeah.
The kids chewing with their mouths open and picking it out of their teeth. And with the children too, they notice things so much younger than you think. I remember when we had to bring Cash into Novus Ordo when your parents picked us up from the airport and they brought Cash in and we had to go to mass and it was the last. Anyways, so he was with us at Novus Ordo.
It was the one he's ever been to.
Yeah, it's the only one he's ever been to, and of course at Novus Ordo the priest does a lot less than at Latin Mass. At Latin Mass, it's all the priest. The priest is doing everything.
Yeah.
And Novus Ordo, the priest is just sitting and letting other people do a lot of the Mass. And Cashin said, how old is he, 2? He was 2.5 or 3 or something.
He was about to be 3. He was basically exactly 3. Mm-hmm.
And we sat in the very last pew because we didn't want him to see these things. And he looked at us and said, why is the priest sitting down? What's the priest? Why isn't the priest doing Mass, basically?
Yeah. And then, of course, so the other thing, kind of going along the same lines, though, and in a certain sense, the more important thing that this brought us to is realizing kind of what I said before, but the Latin Mass aspect of it is just one part. And the most important part, really, is the traditional faith. So, of course, the Mass is part of the faith. It's not just a practice. Father Ripper wrote a great book talking about that. If anybody asks me, of course you should go to Latin Mass, but the greater thing or the better thing and the more important thing is the traditional faith. And so when you say, well, what do you mean by the traditional faith? What I mean by the traditional faith is the faith as it was presented and taught for the first 1925 years of its existence. Mm-hmm. And that is what I mean by the traditional faith.
Yeah, before all the corruption, the stripping down, the watering down of... Yeah. Yeah, and I think everything we just said about the Latin Mass and the differences, and one of the reasons, the number one things we say to someone who says, how do I live a more traditional life? And like you said, it's not the most important thing, but when you're going to the Latin Mass, that is what's going to pour into your everyday life. Yeah. You don't have to go to the Latin Mass to live a traditional faith, but it makes it easier.
Yeah. And you should.
And that's one of the big reasons we're so adamant about it, is because it makes it so much easier for it to pour into the rest of your life. And I think one quick, just off the top of my head example is with the veiling. Mm-hmm. I fought the veil for a while. Mm-hmm. Kyle had said probably for a few months leading up to when I finally did it. He didn't say, well, he said, I really want you to veil. I really want you to wear a veil. And it was the like dragging my feet, like, okay, it just, of course I wasn't used to it. It was even like the dumb attachment things and like the vanity stuff. Like I like to style my hair. And if I style my hair and then wear a veil, well, no one can see my hair. Like those are the kinds of things that I would think, Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of women think the same thing, but they won't admit it. Is like, it is like and that's the whole point of veiling, is that you do have beautiful hair. And that's why you cover it, because you're pointing the glory to God, and it's an act of humility. So you start doing that, on Sundays, and it pours into the rest of your life. Because, of course, that's how you're supposed to be in your household, in your own domestic church, or, to your husband is you're supposed to submit. You're supposed to be humble and have that humility. And so if you just start doing that, just that one tangible step of putting the veil on your head at Mass, it changes quicker than you think. Because I remember the first time I veiled at Mass, it didn't feel weird at all, first of all. It felt like I'd been doing it forever.
Was it at St. Pete? I don't remember.
No, it was at Epiphany.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I remember having it on, and we got into Mass. We were in Mass, and I put it on, and Kyle looked at me and said, "You look so beautiful." I don't know if you remember that.
No, I don't.
And it just made me feel, it makes you feel holy. It just does. And it's not like a holier than thou thing at all. Because, of course, I fought it for so long, but when you feel holy and humble, that's the way you're going to act.
In a certain sense, you are beginning to act humble. So that's the actual more important thing, is that you're not, yes, you're kind of feeling that way, but there's also a certain sense of like you're actually making an act of humility.
Yeah.
And if you want to even think of it as taking up your cross, and the reason it's taking up your cross is because, the curse of Eve is, that you'll desire after your husband and he'll rule over you, right? And there's this form of this desire to not submit. And so like to make that submit, you are taking up the cross. And so you are acting holier.
Yeah.
You're acting more humble, which is going to make you more humble because it's a virtue.
Yeah.
Well, theologically speaking, again, going back it's actually funny. I'll never forget this because when I lived in Pittsburgh, sometimes when I got a new car when I moved out there, because I didn't have a car and I needed a car because when I was working.
The Volkswagen?
Yeah.
Aw.
Yeah. I had that for, how long did I have that for?
Just got rid of it a couple years ago, right?
Yeah, I got rid of it in 2022. So I had it for 10 years.
I rode to our wedding in that car, brought Cashin home in that car.
Yeah, I had it for, so about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
But.
I Like Football was in that car.
Yeah, that's funny.
I know. So crazy.
Which we left out, by the way.
I know. I actually realized that when I was watching it back. I was like, oh, I didn't include the I Like Football bit.
Anyway, but I had like a free Sirius radio or XM radio, whatever it was, subscription for like the first 3 months. And Patrick
That's
Coffin
hilarious.
At the time, so it was Catholic Answers, right? And so this is back when I would listen to Catholic Answers a lot and everything. And there was a question and answer with a bishop, and I don't remember his name. I called in.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you called
I didn't ever tell you this?
No.
That's funny.
I don't think so.
So I called in because I'd read their articles, okay? Mm-hmm. And so they would talk about, also at the time, to be fair, so I'm much less concerned with this side of things these days, like the Catholic versus Protestant. But back in those days, he's still a really great friend of mine, but my best friend is evangelical, and he's very devout and everything, and so like we'd go back and forth. So that sort of stuff was kind of front of my mind and interesting to me and all that. But so I'd read their tracts and I'd read these church fathers, and they would talk about the importance of having to be Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. So like they'd have an article that was doing the, again, focus. What is it highlighting? Talking about this essentially religious indifferentism, right? Like, oh, Catholic Church is the privileged way, and everybody can be saved, and yes, technically they're saved despite the religion, not because of the religion. Everyone's saved through the Catholic Church, but like shouldn't worry about it too much, or be a good atheist over here, or be a good Protestant over here. And I'd read these church fathers, and they were not saying that.
Yeah.
So I called. I said to him, I was like, well, like what's going on here? Because I didn't know.
Yeah. Because you were reading.
Well, I'm saying, I read this thing.
What the church fathers were saying, and they were saying something different. You were.
And I'm like, kind of. Yeah, exactly. And again, that was one of those early things where I was like, this seems to have changed.
Yeah.
And I didn't think anything of it at the time. So the bishop gave me, I'm trying to remember. I don't know, and I don't want to accidentally say the wrong person. So I don't remember who it was. but it would have been in the late summer of 2012. So I asked him, and I forget exactly what he said, but it was something to the same extent, right? Which was, well, the Catholic Church is a true church, and anybody who's saved, if they follow their conscience, is saved through the Catholic Church, etc. And that's a perfect example of where the focus went from, you have to be Catholic. Yes, the church has always said people can be saved outside of visible membership. Mm-hmm. But the ordinary way of salvation is through the sacraments with visible communion with the church. And again, going to those sorts of things is when you live your life with this understanding of how precious salvation is, or if you read, for instance, like the life of St. Francis, and I read that basically until like the last couple of years of his life, when God gave him a supernatural grace of assuring him of his salvation, he was always concerned or worried for his salvation. And then, Joe Blows on the street are not, worried about it, or even the church says, well, like even they don't have to worry about it. And again, it's not about like, oh, so-and-so's damned, that sort of thing. It's more like, okay, so how do you deal with people then? Right? Yeah. Because if so-and-so can be a good atheist over here, and if so-and-so can be a good Protestant over here, then what is the point? And of course, we've seen that in terms of evangelization. It's gone through the floor, like missionary orders and things. But it's just like, those are the sorts of examples where you kind of see those practical changes. It's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle.
No, that's not what I'm thinking of. What am I thinking of? What am I thinking of where it's like few will be saved, basically?
Oh, yeah. Yes, this is actually an excellent one. So he's
I can't remember what it is.
The narrow way. Jesus says, wide is the path that leads to destruction. And then he also says,
many will try and few will be saved.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, many will, try to enter by the narrow way. And many will try and few will make it, however the wording is. But actually, this is the most interesting thing. And this is something that I meditate on. Of everything that I meditate on, this is probably the number one thing. And the reason is because my spiritual director, like for whatever, when he said it to me in this way, the thing that's so interesting about it is when they say, Lord, how do we enter by the narrow way, the narrow gate? He says, essentially, you must strive.
You must strive.
Strive.
Yeah.
Right. So he says, strive.
Sounded like you said drive.
Strive.
Strive, not drive.
Strive.
You must strive, yeah.
You must strive. And, I think the way he says is strive to enter by the narrow gate is how he says it. Few will try, many will try, few will enter. And what's so interesting about that, again, going back to the traditional life, is it's not to say that there's some level of greater fear that you need to have in terms of servile fear. But what grows is there's the greater fear of sin, right? So the offense of God. Mm-hmm. And to think that even to his apostles, he's saying, you must strive. Well, what's strive mean? So I got into an argument with somebody on your post, and this particular person loved twisting words. My favorite was when she said that provision or providing for doesn't mean providing provisions which are typically, food, shelter, clothing, etc. She said, well, it could be support, or, it's like,
emotional
no,
support.
There are definitions. So when strive, it means essentially try hard. You must attempt your best. You must, there's a hardness that it suggests.
Yeah.
And again, it just goes back to that focus, which is,
got chills.
There's just a change of focus. And actually, I would like to do an episode on The Chosen, and the horrendous Christology of the chosen. But, and this goes back to the same thing, right? It's like for instance, when we say the Hail Holy Queen, this like, or in the Psalms, this valley of tears, understand that it's like we're in essentially a path of sorrow. So that sorrow and joy are kind of two sides of the same coin. It doesn't mean that there's no joy. The essence of it is understanding is like that is going to when Jesus says to Peter, like, get behind me, Satan, and the key there really is you're thinking as men do, not as God does. And I think one of the biggest changes that happened at Vatican II from a thought process is the change from the church needs to inform and shape the world to we are going to accept and change for the basic. I can't remember if it was Pope Paul VI or John the 23rd who actually said we're attempting to meet modern man essentially. And I think one of the biggest things is we have these, and we see this especially like when it comes to traditional gender roles, is thinking as men do, meaning humans, not as God does about these things. And so that's really, I guess, what we're trying to do, where I think the traditional faith helps so much. And what it really does is it reorients you to that God focus. It's of course not a cure-all. It's not to say people don't sin or whatever. Yeah. But it's that sort of, it's like that foundational building block of you're building on stone versus on, sand or wood or something like that.
Yeah. That's a really good way to put it.
That's really how I view it. And then when you view salvation and grace and these sorts of things back through the way the Catholic Church has always taught, I'd say in the beginning, there's always going to be adjustments. Things are difficult at first. You're like, I don't like that, essentially.
Yeah, kind of letting go of some comforts, really.
Yeah, and of course, yes, letting go of comforts for sure. But I'm saying even just the way of doing things.
Well, I think that's what I meant. Is there's a certain kind of comfort in
zone.
Doing what you're used to doing.
Yes, for sure. So it's that sort of thing of maybe previously on Sundays was a day where now if you do it recreation, but maybe you were like, oh yeah, I work 7 days a week, or I like taking Friday and Saturday off and work, or on Sundays
we do yard work.
Yeah. And if certain things are for recreation, like some people do think,
Yeah, like gardening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember one time I was working on a project. I think I was or sewing something within the house. And you were like, do you like doing that? And I was like, yeah, why? And he goes, well, it's Sunday, so I just want to make sure you're doing it because you like it, not because,
because, right. So it's like it's the servile work, but there can be those sorts of things can be recreational, right? So, just making those kind of changes. Or one of the biggest things, of course, is the gender roles. I feel like we've gone so long in this episode that kind of deserve its own thing. Falling into those proper gender roles, because obviously right now one of the highlighted things, not only just because of your post, but it's been talked about a lot, is women working. So that's a big part of it, right? Oh, trad wife staying home. But there's both sides, because there's husbands who don't want to make decisions.
They don't want to deal with the repercussions of stepping into more of a leadership role, because a lot of husbands they do have wives who are not going to like it, and they're going to have to deal with kind of the retaliation of the wife for a while. Right. Until, for lack of better words, she kind of falls in line.
Yeah. No, exactly. Right. So it's so men who are shirk their responsibilities
for the sake of peace.
Yeah, for the sake of peace or whatever, or don't like leading, aren't spiritual. Aren't spiritual heads. They don't pray for their family. So there's.
Sorry, isn't that the curse of Adam too?
Yeah. So the curse of Adam is to work by the sweat of his brow, and so his tendency or his concupiscence is towards laziness. Whereas a woman's concupiscence tends more towards lack of submission.
Yeah. And you see that, it's just so interesting, because even if it's not physical laziness, you do see that all the time in the lack of decision making, the lack of really taking on that leadership role.
It's there's a certain element of spiritual sloth. I mean, the one thing is it's not taught properly, right? Like, so for instance, I would say people are saying to the trad wives, as it were, hey, listen, or like just to wives, motherhood's top notch. You being a full-time mother is great. You don't have to, like, your value isn't in the marketplace, and people are saying it's like you have to be good men, but like people are not saying now. There are some, right, and I think there are some bad voices too, like the Andrew Tates of the world. They'll see some problems correctly, but I mean he's terrible in most of the ways.
Gross.
But a lot of people will say that to mothers, but they won't say, hey, Christian men, take control of your household, make the decisions.
It's still demonized, kind of.
Right. The big thing is mutual submission. Under the mission. It's ridiculous. But so that's where I see a big problem. So I'm saying, like, the average man, like, they don't know that they should do that. Or
that's a good point.
And I'd say, like I said before, right, like, because of feminism, feminism is obviously in so many ways internalized. It's internalized even if, like, somebody's like, oh, the provider and the protector, but then it's like, oh, we make equal decisions, we decide together, we do this, that, and the other thing. Where there's not like a true order in the household. So anyway, my point is like, so I see that as a big issue. Men are not encouraged to be that way. They don't know how to do it. And if anything, they're like kind of given backlash if they do, right? Like, so for instance, if somebody has a working wife and he said, I don't want you to work anymore, in general, he would not be supported in that. People say, oh, you're being controlling or you're being bossy. Like, even in Catholic, it's like mutual submission, this sort of thing. Now they might say to her, oh, well, this, that, or the other thing, like, are you sure you don't want to stay home, etc.? But they would never say, and I'm sure there are some people, but in general, people are not going to say, hey, you need to submit to your husband and you need to stop working if he wants you to stop working. Like, so there's certainly a rock and a hard place there.
It's also just so crazy to me because I remember you saying to me one time in regards to submission, like the submission of the wife, is when a wife is submissive, it makes the husband want to never say no to her. It just makes sense. Like, I think about with my kid, with like having children, for example. If Cashin is having the morning where he's just like so sweet and he's listening to me, he's doing things, and then he comes and asks me if he wants something, I'm gonna be a little more. I'm gonna say yes, probably. Can you elaborate on that anymore?
Sure. So I mean, I would say is like when you don't have the animosity, first of all, like there's no ego, there's no one-upping, there's no like, oh, I'm going to show her or teach her a lesson, whatever. So just like kind of you were talking about, right? Like when somebody has a pleasing personality, when they're agreeable, etc., you want to please them. And in a certain sense, Adam, the reason they fell is like it says, he wanted to be close to his wife, right? So like essentially, in a disordered way, he wanted to not upset his wife. He wanted to keep the peace, and by doing that, he didn't fulfill his duty and etc. But like, so there is that desire to please their wives just naturally. The other thing is husbands like doing things for their wives, like being the hero or being the like I think there's a joke, it's like, let your husband go on quests. It is true, right? Like if it like pro tip to the women who are listening, like when your husband says something like, do you want me to do this? Because it's not like they're not offering like, now maybe if he says, you want me to do that? Okay. Yeah, that's different. But if he's like, you want, we could get that for dinner or whatever, He's saying, let me do this for you, is what he's saying. So that's what I'm saying though, is that like when you have the submissive wife who doing that, it's like you want to also be that person for your wife.
It's so easy to submit 99.9% of the time. I can't think of one instance really where I was like, oh, I have to submit to this. Like, I mean, I get it if you I mean, I know there are exceptions, and not everyone, has that situation, but you can get there. Because I think another thing that people don't realize is the more you live your role in an ordered and right way, the more the spouse, like the respective spouse, will fall into their role as well. So the more that you're submitting, the more your husband is going to lead, and vice versa. And I'm not saying it's going to happen instantly, but it will happen.
Yeah. Just in terms of, especially those who are thinking of submitting, or kind of like, I have to submit to, or like, what's this really mean? Or, no, mutual submission or something is, you get to submit. And there is a certain difficulty, right? Because what are you doing? You're mortifying your will. That's what you have to do. The thing is that we all have to mortify our will to conform our will to God's will. But here is the thing. And so this is I'm talking about now true obedience. I'm not talking about fake obedience to sinful things, or, it's like, oh, if the Pope said something, you have to obey that. No, not necessarily. What true obedience is, in this sense, is, well, of course, somebody has to have the authority, and it's like a rightly ordered thing, right? Like, so for instance,
right, you're saying,
it's within the realm of authority. And so this is the thing that's difficult for women, but I think if you understand and learn what the church has taught about this and taught about spirituality, that it's actually a great gift. So the church is actually very consistent. The Bible is very consistent in obeying your husband in all things next to Christ. And right, and then also they say where it doesn't object to Christian piety. So that would be sinning, essentially. In holiness, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to convert your will. You're trying to mortify your will in such a way that it's conformed to God's will. And, thereby increasing charity, etc. One of the hardest things to do in relation to that is knowing what God's will is for your life in the present moment. It's a difficult thing. Obedience, the amazing aspect of obedience, and we know this from St. Alphonsus Liguori talks about it, St. Francis de Sales talks about it, St. Thomas Aquinas talks about it. Obedience, and this is why all orders make a vow of obedience to their superior, and then, on and on and on, is because what obedience does is it mortifies your will. In almost everything in your life as a religious is, in a certain sense, decided for you. And in submitting to that, you also have the ability to be confident that you're doing God's will in that moment. So, as a husband, as a father, you don't have a proximate leader. You don't have a proximate authority, right? So you have a priest, a parish priest, he's the leader of, the spiritual family or whatever. But in terms of, he can't say to you, oh no, don't go to that church, or no, don't move there. He does not have that immediate authority. The wife does. They have their husband. So when the church says, be subject to your husband, obey your husband in all things, it is actually a great gift, because if you're doing your normal duties and you're obeying your husband, and of course it's not like your husband's following you around saying like, do this, do this, do this, and you're obeying your husband, you can actually be confident that you're doing the will of God in that moment. In terms of like the simplicity of the path to holiness of a wife and mother, it's actually a tremendous gift that they have that, because it is so simple and straightforward in that sense. Yeah,
we're not having to navigate the world and all of these crazy things.
Yeah, of course. And of course, like there's also...
To the extent that...
Yeah, it's certainly true, where it's a great benefit to not pay attention to the things of the world, because when you don't pay attention to the things of the world, you have a greater peace. And again, you can give more attention to heavenly things than earthly things. And you have that ability. Again, it should be rightly ordered. The husband should be doing that. The husband shouldn't be putting worries and fears onto his wife, etc. Of course. So those things are all true. But what I'm talking about especially is in terms of encouraging those people who are essentially might be a little scared or hesitant, where they say, like, what does this really look like? But to know that you actually are doing God's will in that moment, even if it's not the perfect action. Of course, you can't do a mortal sin, but actually a lot of the, Thomas Aquinas, St. Alphonsus, etc., they've actually said that it's like if you obey and it's a venial sin, that it's actually a venial sin for the person commanding it. It's not a venial sin for you because you're obeying that authority, right? So, like, again, we're not talking about mortal sin here, not grave matter, okay? But in the ascent of the holy mountain, it is a great, and I'm frankly jealous of it, but it is a great grace.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Roman Catechism, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, and the key to this catechism is, first of all, it has explanations. So if you want the Baltimore Catechism or the Catechism of Pius the 10th or the Credo Catechism from Bishop Snyder, those are all good. They're in question and answer form, so it's very simple. It's really, but this has a lot of good explanations. But this has never been abrogated. It is an unchanged catechism, and the key to this, again, going back, and actually I meant to talk about a little bit about what Father Ripperger says, and actually same thing with what my spiritual director says about.
If you want, go ahead.
No, I'll go into another time about how many modern Catholics are in such error over so many things. Father Ripperger says it's almost impossible not to hold some sort of error because of the lack of clarity, and then also this priest said basically everybody has internalized some form of modernism. That basically, so when we think of traditionally thinking of modernists, it's people who are like, oh, God doesn't exist, but the supernatural aspect of God doesn't exist, or omega point, or just whatever. But the point is that the average person has modernist tendencies, beliefs, etc., and they don't realize it. But so that's why I always suggest this book, and we'll put it in the notes. The point is that with all of those catechisms, you read what it says, you believe what it says, you know that you're good. The whole thing about the Latin Mass, doing this podcast, the traditional faith, is that ultimately they're conducive to holiness. And what I think we really want for people is to be able to find sort of that path to holiness, and what it looks like, what the church has always said that it looks like. I'm sure we'll have episodes on it, but I'm not particularly interested in the different Catholic wars about whatever things are, or Protestant versus Catholic stuff. Like I said, I'm sure something will come
we'll
up.
Cover lots of different things, but that's not the main
my main
goal.
thing is the what we call the ascent of Mount Carmel, or the ascent of the spiritual life, and what doing the right things, learning these traditional spiritualities, what they can do for you. And I think the other thing, of course, is that they're the spiritual life versus other things. I think there are more errors there than in any place else. Sexual stuff, as an example, every Orthodox Catholic gets that right. Doctrinal stuff less, but the spiritual life and what it really means, what it really looks like, what the masters say and teach is completely different than what is presented in typically speaking. And that's what I'm most interested in, is people becoming holy.
Do you want to do a couple?
Sure.
questions?
Let's go. Let's rock today.
The difference in priests between Novus Ordo parishes and traditional Latin Mass parishes.
So first of all, of course, seminaries were in a terrible way for a long time. They're still not all the way. They've gotten much, much better. Younger priests, by and large, are more traditional.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it comes down to formation and how they're formed in specifically with Aquinas as their foundation, but like, again, in these, traditional Catholic philosophers and writers, the formation
is better.
Is just better,
I was just laughing thinking about Anna when Anna and Joe were going to spiritual direction with Father Bartholomew.
Oh, yeah.
And she had just finished the devotion to the Sacred Heart, and she got the Sacred Heart tattooed on her wrist, and she was all excited to show him. And so they go to their spiritual direction, and he was like, "What is that?" He noticed it. And she was like, "Yeah, I did the the devotion to the Sacred Heart, so I got the Sacred Heart tattooed on my wrist." And he just took her hand. He said so gently, he just goes, "No more tattoos." No more tattoos. And she was like,
So all of your siblings now go to the Latin Mass. Your parents go.
My grandparents.
Your grandparents go and your aunts go. Yeah. Now, and again, across the board, it has been life-changing for everybody. For me, of my 5 siblings, I guess, let me think. My 2 brothers here go. Ethan goes. So Carson doesn't. He lives in Manhattan, and I guess it's far. I don't know. Then Caroline and her husband, they go when they can. They live on an army base in the middle of nowhere, so it's really far and tough.
Yeah.
And then my parents go most of the time, I suppose, on Sundays. And and so again, it's been life-changing. And I haven't met somebody who's like, "Oh yeah, I gave it a shot," and it just didn't work for me. Not to say there's not people who didn't have bad experience.
I've gotten so many messages from girls who were like, "I went to my first Latin Mass and I was so confused the whole time and I had no idea what was going on, but I absolutely loved it, and that's where I'm going now."
Yeah.
And I just love that. I think that's such a testament to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is just test it out.
Yeah.
Try it.
A high Mass first is always.
Yeah, high Mass, and give it a few weeks. Give it a few weeks, and
you'll love it.
You'll love it.
We guarantee it. It's our guarantee. Thank you for listening to the Trad Line.